We investigate cases of the paranormal. They start in the realm of the unknown and end in the black vault. What is a ghost? Is it the soul of a dead person, a shadowy disembodied spirit haunting the living? If so, what kind of ghost might emerge after the death of someone evil? Today's story concerns the strange occurrences surrounding a desperate woman, a dead body, and a house full of buried secrets. Let's open the black vault and investigate. Rootstown, Ohio, 2005. 85-year-old Peter Wesley was dead. In reality, he's had one foot in the grave for the last 20 years, but had been kept living and breathing by his put-upon 35-year-old daughter, Julia. She stood over her father's lifeless body and felt relieved. More than relieved. She felt free for the first time in her life. A life that, up until now, had been in service of her ailing father. As of 8:30 p.m., that service had officially ended. But his withered, gnarled body had to go, now. It had been just the two of them for as long as she could remember. Julia never knew a single, solitary day when she was alone in the house. It had always been her and him. As long as his body still required her care, it wasn't over. Julia picked up the phone to call Dr. Harris. It took all her strength not to explode into maniacal laughter as she described finding her father dead, having died peacefully in his sleep. She requested the body be removed from the house immediately. Actually, it was more like a demand. To her frustration, Dr. Harris informed Julia that it would be impossible. Roads to the house were flooded. Neither him or the hospital would be able to reach the house until the storm passed. It had rained nonstop in Rootstown for 3 days. The Wesley house sat on the outskirts of town, flanked by 5 miles of thick forest. Dirt roads to and from the house were transformed into overflowing shallow rivers. The Wesley house always seemed to be hiding away from the world. That week, it was practically cut off from civilization. Julia was trapped in the house with her father's dead body. She opened up a bottle of wine, a special bottle hidden in the back of the cabinet, saved for this very occasion. She made a toast to her freedom. Freedom from the violent outbursts and verbal abuse. Freedom from the adult diapers and soiled bed sheets. Freedom from never having to hear him whisper, "I'll never let you go." At 35, Julia had never seen outside of Ohio. She hadn't even crossed county lines, but now she would. She sipped the wine straight from the bottle and listened to the wind and sheets of rain battering the house. A rat scampered past her feet. She angrily attempted to stomp it. Those damn rats. Ever since the basement flooded, rodents have spilled into every corner of the house. The rat poison didn't kill the little ones, but it worked great on the bigger pests. That's when she heard it. The sound echoed above her, then again. She wondered if a strong gust of wind had pushed a window open. She heard the sound again, like someone was walking across the old floorboards above her. Julia moved slowly up the steps to investigate the strange sound. She stopped at the second floor landing. The house was quiet, other than the sound of the storm raging outside. It's an old, restless house, she thought, one that was known to groan and whine when the weather turned nasty. Julia stopped at her father's door and hesitated. It was out of fear, and that fear was a habit, that feeling of misery on the other side of the door. But there was nothing to be afraid of anymore. Her father, once a force of uncontrollable rage and spite, was nothing but decaying tissue now. Whatever hold he had on her was gone, like the final breath in his chest. She pushed open the door. The room was dark and quiet. It still smelled of rubbing alcohol and bleach. Julia moved in closer. Her father's eyes were open. She didn't remember them being open. She also didn't remember the corners of his slack mouth turned up, revealing the faint hint of a smile. Julia leaned in. There was a loud pounding at the front door. She jumped back, startled, dropping the wine bottle. Maybe the doctor changed his mind, she thought. Or maybe he called an ambulance and they made it through the storm. Julia raced downstairs, feeling the cavalry had come not a minute too soon. She threw open the door, and no one was there. Just the darkness of the surrounding woods. Julia warmed herself in front of the fireplace. She recalled a thought that had crossed her mind once. She didn't remember exactly when. It must have been one of those especially bad days when her father seemed to relish in her suffering, like it were a game and only he knew the rules. Julia remembered wondering about evil people and what happened when they die. Would a black soul leave an equally dark stain on the world, like a slimy residue? Or maybe evil can't ever truly die. The power went out, plunging the house into darkness, except for the flickering light of the fireplace. Julia wasn't surprised. The house's electrical wiring was ancient, and the old man was too cheap to replace it. However, thanks to Peter's reliance on life-saving medical equipment, a gas-powered generator had been installed in the basement for emergencies. Julia always hated the basement. It was like a damp, dark tomb. She would daydream sometimes, when her father could still walk, that he would trip on the steps and tumble to the concrete floor, breaking his neck instantly. Then she could nail the door shut and leave him down there to rot. Or maybe the rats would have at him. With flashlight in hand, she sloshed her way to the far end of the basement where the generator sat. It would take forever to pump the water out, she thought, but maybe just leave it, pack her things and move away. Let the house and all its painful memories sink into the muddy ground. That's when she noticed ripples in the water, circling out from the dark corner. She whipped around with her flashlight and froze. Her father pointed at her from the shadows, his eyes bulging, his mouth twisted into a frown. Julia's heart seized in her chest. She blinked, and the nightmarish vision of her father was gone. No, Julia said defiantly to herself. In that moment, her desire for survival supplanted her fear. She swore never to be terrorized by him again. Julia grabbed a steel shovel leaning against the wall. The rain was still falling hard. It stung like needles against Julia's face as she drove the shovel's spade into the ground. She sent clumps of mud and grass flying through the air as she dug with an obsessive fury. It was a cold and miserable night, but Julia dug and dug, remembering how she had always dreamt of this day. The day when she would see him lowered into the ground, a lump of rotting meat, being devoured by worms in a dark hole for all eternity. She had always told herself that there was a last time for everything, and this was it. No storm, no muddy ground, no ghost was going to get in her way. Julia raced back into the house and up the stairs. Her father continued to lay still in his bed. She glared down at him, remembering a promise that she had made to herself, that he would never, ever outlive her. As Julia lifted his corpse off the mattress, She could feel his muscles stiffening. It was like pulling a sack of wet sand across the floor. Her mission was clear. She wouldn't wait for Dr. Harris or the ambulance. His corpse and all his inhuman menace needed to be out of the house now. She would only be free when he was in the ground. Julia dragged Peter across the backyard, leaving a trail of mud from the house. The rain had already begun to fill her makeshift grave with water. She heaved her father's rigid body into the hole. He slid into the muddy water with a splash. Julia filled in the grave, watching with glee as he disappeared under the shovelfuls of mud. She stood back, taking a moment to appreciate the mound of dirt that stood between her and her dead father. Julia hoped his memory would be as easy to bury as his twisted body. She turned to head back to the house when something grabbed her leg. She choked on a scream. The torrential storm that had engulfed Rootstown stopped 2 days after Julia placed that call to Dr. Harris. With the roads drying, he was finally able to visit the Wesley house. Julia hadn't been answering the phone, so he was concerned. The front door was open. Dr. Harris called out to Julia, but received no response. The house was quiet. On the floor, a trail of muddy footprints went from the front door up the steps to the second floor. The good doctor found Peter laying in his bed. He looked peaceful, almost as if he were sleeping. Dr. Harris examined the body. Peter was certainly dead. However, the body showed very little sign of decay, surprising after 2 days. But where was Julia? Dr. Harris investigated the property and eventually found her, buried in the backyard. Her hand stuck out of the ground, reaching for the sky, almost as if she had been dragged down into the mud. It remains a mystery what happened in Julia's last moments. Dr. Harris reported her death as a freak accident, but the look on Julia's face, the horror, he had never witnessed anything so terrifying in his life, and it was not something he would soon forget. One last item of note. Dr. Harris performed an autopsy on Peter. A fatal quantity of rat poison was found in his bloodstream. A ghost can be many things. A messenger from beyond, a harbinger of events to come, and in Julia's case, perhaps a promise kept that he would never let her go. Join me next time for another mysterious case of the paranormal that emerged from the depths of the unknown and currently resides in the Black Vault. We investigate cases of the paranormal. They start in the realm of the unknown and end in the Black Vault. Precognition is defined as the ability to peer into the future through paranormal means. Throughout history, there have been numerous mysterious sightings that accurately predicted future events. But is precognition a gift to mankind or a curse? Today's story concerns a young man with a tragic past, a terrifying encounter with the unknown, and a brief look into the future. Let's open the Black Vault and investigate. Roanoke, Virginia, 1967. The funeral of Alan Willis was a tragedy for everyone who knew and loved him, but more so for the wife and the son he left behind. Jenny, 38, was numb, not knowing how to feel. She had loved Alan, but Being a traveling salesman, he was always on the road, barely around for the last 5 years, leaving Jenny to raise Patrick, age 13, practically alone. Alan died in a car accident. He was drunk and fell asleep at the wheel. His car crashed into a telephone pole, killing him instantly. Jenny had half expected this to happen eventually, driving as much as he did. Nevertheless, it was still a shock, and the timing couldn't have been worse, with Patrick still a child and the bills piling up. The funeral was confusing for Patrick. It was true he didn't get an opportunity to grow close to his father, but he was also too young to understand death and all the questions that surround it. Patrick couldn't comprehend what it meant to die, the finality of mortality, and what happens next. The priest had lots to say during his eulogy concerning the great reward that awaited good men like Alan after death, but it was of very little comfort. Patrick wondered why bad things happened to good people, and if one could ever stop those bad things from happening. He sat quietly throughout the Mass, a little boy on the edge of an existential crisis. Following the funeral, Jenny and Patrick drove back to their home in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. They didn't speak. Jenny stared out at the darkened road, emotionless. Patrick sat in the back seat, staring out the window. The night was dark, made even darker by miles of dense forest. As the car traveled down the winding mountain road, something strange caught Patrick's eye. He squinted, focusing his gaze on a floating light. He thought it was the full moon at first, but the light was red, and it was moving through the trees, matching the speed of the car. Patrick blinked, trying to get a handle on what he was seeing. A glowing red light, like a ball of fire, shooting through the dark treetops at incredible speed. He watched as the light grew closer. It gained altitude and quickly moved over the road, casting a winged shadow down on the vehicle. Patrick craned his neck, attempting to get a better look. The car's power switched off. The engine sputtered with a choking sound, then went silent. Confused, Jenny gripped the steering wheel tightly as the vehicle slowed to a stop in the middle of the dark road. She turned the ignition. The engine didn't respond. The car was mysteriously dead, and the night grew quiet. No wind, no crickets, just an eerie silence. A loud hiss of static emerged from the car radio. A haunting voice echoed out from the speakers. A panicked male voice spilled out of the staticky noise, screaming. It was difficult to make out what was being said clearly, except for the word Mayday and the numbers 4182. Jenny glanced up. A shadowy figure stood on the road. It was tall. How tall she couldn't be sure, but it was very tall, with long wings sweeping down its back and glowing red eyes. Patrick peeked over the passenger seat. It was real because they were both looking at it, and it was looking at them. It flew toward the car, and over it, both Jenny and Patrick quickly spun around, peering out the back window. The mysterious creature had vanished into the night sky. Mother and son sat motionless, quietly processing what they had just witnessed. The car sprang to life, engine rumbling, lights illuminating the country road ahead. Jenny composed herself before grabbing the steering wheel and pressing gently on the accelerator. She didn't talk to Patrick about what they had just experienced. No words were exchanged on the ride home. But the boy's mind was racing. The image of the glowing red eyes forever burned. into his memory. 30 years passed. Patrick was grown and now living in Evansville, Tennessee. He worked as a sales representative for a surgical supplies company and had a pregnant wife, 32-year-old Melanie. Like his father, his job kept him on the road almost 300 days out of the year. Life hadn't been easy for Patrick. After his father's death, his mother had become cold and distant, leaving him to navigate the world on his own. He had made many mistakes and was on the road to making many more, again following in his father's footsteps. July 3rd, 1997. Patrick never had a peaceful night's sleep, not because of the lumpy, uncomfortable motel beds, but because of a persistent nightmare he would have. A nightmare of a winged creature that appeared to him and his mother so many years ago. The nightmare was always the same. He's at his father's funeral. The church is empty, except for the coffin and a crow perched atop it. He inches closer and sees himself lying inside. Arms reach out, pulling him screaming into the coffin. Patrick suddenly finds himself alone in the dark woods. He runs, bolting through the tangle of branches. Patrick looks up. The creature with the glowing red eyes hovers above him. The forest around him bursts into flames. Patrick howls in agony as he burns. He was awoken by the sound of a phone ringing. It was Melanie. She was calling from the hospital. The baby wasn't supposed to be due for another couple of weeks, but Melanie went into labor. His wife would never forgive him for missing the birth of their first child, so Patrick was in a race against time to get home. The fastest way was to fly out of Yeager Airport in West Virginia. He sped through the dense mountains, praying he would get home in time. Being that it was 4th of July weekend, flights were fully booked, even in the middle of the night. As luck would have it, the airline was able to find Patrick a single seat on a flight that was just about to take off. Flight 4182. He froze as he was handed the ticket. 4182. The flight number ricocheted inside his head like a stray bullet. Taking his seat, Patrick could feel the blood in his veins grow icy. He wasn't a superstitious man, even with the bizarre encounter that had haunted him since childhood, but he was engulfed by fear. The sheer coincidence of it, that haunting distress call, the horror in the man's voice as he screamed out those numbers. 4182. What could it mean? Then he pictured Melanie at the hospital, holding their son and wondering where he was. Patrick disembarked the plane just before takeoff. He would probably be late now, but driving didn't feel like cold water poured down his spine. As Patrick drove, a feeling of embarrassment came over him. Had he overreacted, Patrick thought? Coincidences happen all the time, and maybe this was just another one. A bizarre coincidence for sure, but worthy of running the risk of missing the birth of his first child? The echo of a distant roar and a flash of light appeared in the sky. Patrick pulled over and stopped the car. There was a fiery trail across the sky and arcing downward. The blazing aftermath of a jetliner exploding as it hit cruising altitude. Patrick could only watch as glowing pieces of metal fell from the sky. Flaming debris from Flight 4182. Patrick made it to the hospital in time to see the birth of his baby boy. They named him Matthew. Patrick never told Melanie that he had almost been on Flight 4182, or why he chose not to fly that day. Only that he felt very lucky that his son won't know the pain of growing up without a father like he did. He would make sure of that. A glimpse of the future could mean luck or misfortune, depending on the message and who receives it. For Patrick, it meant breaking a cycle of tragedy and an opportunity to travel down a better path. Join me next time for another mysterious case of the paranormal that emerged from the depths of the unknown and currently resides in the Black Vault. We investigate cases of the paranormal. They start in the realm of the unknown and end in the Black Vault. The ghoul is derived from the Arabic legend of a demonic being that inhabits deserted burial grounds. It is known to us as a loathsome creature who feeds on the rotting flesh of corpses. Is there a place where this disturbing legend and grim reality collide? And could it be right under our feet? Today's story concerns a pair of young podcasters with a morbid curiosity, a scandalous secret, and a gruesome truth that won't stay buried. Let's open the Black Vault and investigate. Peabody, Massachusetts, 2019. Off the main road that cuts through town and tucked away in the woods is the Sacred Hollow Cemetery. It's a lonely place, a New England relic, choked in overgrowth, rarely visited and mostly forgotten. But not entirely, not by those with an unquenchable thirst for the darker side of history. Enter Michaela West and Jasper Kincaid, both 24. Two intrepid reporters with a nose for exploring the shadowy underbelly of everyday life. What started out as a hobby a few years ago for Michaela and Jasper became a full-time occupation. As teens, they loved staying up late, watching horror films and true crime documentaries. For as long as they could remember, Michaela and Jasper were intrinsically drawn to the darker side of human nature. Midnight Snack was the name of their popular podcast. It featured true stories of murder and monsters, delving deep into infamous cases and urban legends. They were both very excited about visiting Sacred Hill for tonight's podcast. It was a special episode on location where the murder supposedly happened. It was autumn and the night air was cool. Michaela and Jasper didn't seem remotely frightened as they entered the grounds, dried leaves crunching under their feet. They lived for this, dark, uninhabited spaces hiding darker secrets. After all, cemeteries are quiet resting places for loved ones. There's nothing to fear here. The pair set up camp in an abandoned chapel at the far end of the cemetery. A full moon casts its light down on the grounds, creating the perfect atmosphere. This episode of Midnight Snack would be one to remember, they stated proudly to themselves. It wasn't just the atmosphere that provided the ideal backdrop for Midnight Snack, but the urban legend itself that Michaela and Jasper were covering that evening. The horrifying tale of Oz McKee. The Scourge of Peabody, a small-town serial killer and cannibal who preyed on the locals, men, women, children. McKee didn't discriminate, which is why he had been so difficult to capture. From 1954 to 1957, the townspeople of Peabody lived in abject fear of the killer they dubbed the Ghoul. What exactly happened that fateful night in October is sketchy, almost as if the details of the event were purposely hidden from the public. What is known is on Halloween night in 1957, McKee was spotted and chased through the streets by an armed mob. He made his way to Sacred Hollow Cemetery, where he was cornered. The townspeople accosted Oz and tossed him into a freshly dug grave. They buried him alive. No judge, no jury, but in the minds of the townspeople, justice. They swore never to utter a word of their crime or speak of the Ghoul. The rumor started shortly after of a pale figure wandering the cemetery grounds at night, feeding in the shadows. Coffins would be found unearthed, flesh from the corpses chewed off, down to the bone. According to legend, Oz McKee didn't suffocate to death that Halloween night. He dug tunnels under the graveyard using his bare hands, surviving on the flesh of interred bodies. And there, under the soil, in the darkness, transformed into something altogether different, something inhuman, something evil. It's this legend that piqued the interest of Michaela and Jasper, so they decided to take their show to Peabody and the Sacred Hollow Cemetery. As intelligent, serious young people, naturally they didn't believe the legend was true, but it was an excellent topic for their podcast, and being on the grounds gave the morbid material some authenticity. So why did Michaela feel like she was being watched the moment they entered the cemetery? Jasper felt it as well. There were no guards on the property, and the closest house was miles away. It was an unsettling feeling, eyes peering out of the darkness, watching their every move. Not allowing their imagination to get the best of them, Michaela and Jasper continued to focus on preparing for their show. After all, it was their job to do the scaring. With a makeshift studio set up, they were ready to begin recording. Jasper was performing a sound check when he began to hear something strange in his headphones. Not chirping crickets or rustling leaves. He couldn't make out the bizarre sound at first, but listened intently. What was it? Chewing? Proving he had learned nothing from the hundreds of horror films he's seen, Jasper went alone to investigate. The cemetery was a confusing maze of headstones and dilapidated mausoleums. Jasper let his microphone lead the way as he moved through the eroded monuments. Following the bizarre sound was difficult, as it seemed to echo all around him. The sound grew louder as Jasper approached an open grave. He thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but something shifted in the moonlight. A flash of movement inside the deep hole. A look of fear crossed his face. Jasper lifted his cell phone to take a picture and inched closer. Michaela's concern began to grow when Jasper didn't return or answer her repeated calls. Something had to be wrong, so she decided to go out after him. Maybe he got turned around and was lost. Something that could easily happen in an old cemetery like this one. Michaela made her way up and down the twisted paths, her flashlight lighting the way. For a person with a foot firmly planted in the world of horror, this was getting all too real. What started out as an exciting adventure turned into a sickening feeling in the pit of Michaela's stomach. She stumbled across the open grave. Sitting on the ground at her feet was Jasper's headphones and cell phone. Michaela's fear bubbled up inside her. This was no longer the result of an active imagination. Her partner in crime would never abandon his gear in the dirt. Michaela picked up Jasper's phone and switched it on. Her eyes widened with fright upon seeing the last image he had taken. A violent attack, a glimpse of something pale and monstrous. That's when she heard Jasper's distant, muffled scream, somewhere in the graveyard, echoing through the rows of weathered tombstones. Michaela raced through the eroding maze, chasing the sound of her friend's panicked howls. She stopped dead at a mausoleum and cautiously inched closer to it, whispering Jasper's name. His hand reached out of the gloomy crypt, grasping at Michaela through the bars. "Run," he roared at her. "Run for your life." Before she could set Jasper free, she caught a glimpse of something perched atop the mausoleum. A pale, skeletal figure glaring down at her with large, wild eyes and wet, sharp fangs that glistened in the moonlight. Michaela gasped, shuddering with terror, before stumbling backwards and running. She bolted through the stone jungle with no sense of direction, no idea if she was racing towards the entrance of the cemetery or away from it. The soil collapsed under Michaela, causing her legs to buckle. She dropped down into the dark as a small hole opened up under her feet. Michaela hit the ground hard, crumpling into a heap. The wind had been knocked out of her. As she regained her senses, Michaela was instantly hit by the stale air and smell of root rot, and something else, something dead and decaying. She scrambled for the flashlight and switched it on. It was a tunnel about 5 feet high. The earthen walls were a tangle of twisted roots and mulch, and there were bones everywhere. Michaela crawled fast, lighting the narrow tunnel in front of her. Where does it lead? Once again, she barreled forward, hoping and praying she'll come across a way out. The tunnel opened up to a wider chamber. Michaela spun around with her flashlight. It was a network of tunnels, branching out in all directions. Could one of these tunnels lead to the exit? It could take hours to try them all, maybe even days. Without warning, the pale creature lunged out of the dark behind Michaela, cracking her across the head with a chunk of stone. Her vision blurred before everything went black. Michaela regained consciousness. She was laying on her back, her wrists and ankles tightly bound by rope. The smell of the soil and rotten wood surrounded her. Michaela was lying in an old coffin. She struggled to free her hands, but to no avail. A figure appeared above her, its gaunt, crooked shape lit by the moonlight. Michaela knew what this thing was, although she grappled with the reality of it. It was Oz McKee. At least, it used to be, before it stopped being human. Michaela had done her research. "You can't eat me," Michaela pleaded. "I'm not dead." The creature gripped the lid of the coffin and licked his lips. "For later, then," he hissed, before closing the lid shut. Her cries would go unheard because no one visits Secret Hollow anymore, for good reason. Michaela and Jasper promised their followers an extra special episode of Midnight Snack, but it never came. The podcast had gone dark. In fact, the program's hosts seemed to have disappeared as well. No one knows exactly what happened to Michaela West and Jasper Kincaid, but there are plenty of true crime podcasts exploring their untimely disappearance. Midnight Snack set out to prove there's always a kernel of truth to urban legends. Michaela and Jasper discovered that truth the hard way, and in the process, became urban legends themselves. Apparently, irony was on the menu. Join me next time for another mysterious case of the paranormal that emerged from the depths of the unknown and currently resides in the Black Vault.